This is the brand new Garmin Forerunner 165. Yes, another Forerunner has joined the lineup, and it represents the latest edition as sort of the budget entry-level option. And if you're unfamiliar with the Forerunner lineup, it's mainly designed for runners, but these watches do a lot of other stuff as well for swimming, outdoor activities, and more. So it may be of interest to you, even if you're not a runner. So at the time of filming this video, the Forerunner lineup looks something like this. There's the cheapest entry-level model being the Forerunner 55 from about 3 years ago. I'll still include it because it hasn't been updated yet, so technically it's still in the lineup. Then there's the new Garmin Forerunner 165 here. Above that is the Forerunner 265, and all the way at the top, being the most expensive and feature-packed, will be the 965. But that's not really the end of the story here, because on top of the Forerunner line, there's also the Garmin Venu 3 I have here, and the Garmin Vivoactive 5 as well. And in many ways, these watches are very similar from both their price point and feature set, and we're going to talk all about these watches and how they compare. In this video, I'm going to walk through all of the new and exciting features about the Garmin Forerunner 165, and along the way, also share my thoughts on the hardware, the user interface, and we'll also take a look at more nerdy things like GPS and heart rate accuracy as well. And on top of that, I've also got lots of comparison charts to show you that I've painstakingly prepared to try to make this a bit less confusing, because trust me, this gets very confusing with all these different models. And at the end of this video, we'll sort of wrap it all up and discuss who I think this watch is for and whether or not I think it's right for you. To kick things off, let's talk about pricing and options. As usual, this watch comes in 2 different versions, which I thought they were going to stop doing, but they didn't on this one. There's a non-music version that starts at $249 here in the USA, and then there's a music version for $50 more at $299. Now, between those 2 models, there will be 4 color options available, which I'll throw up on the screen now. I've got the sort of blue, teal, light blue color, which is kind of interesting. It's not my favorite color in the world, but I can imagine some people really like this. Let's jump back to the music topic for a second. Both the non-music and music version of the 165 are identical. They both have the same features, the same GPS chipset, the same battery life, etc. The only difference is going to be the presence of onboard storage for music on the music version. So the music version I have here has 4 gigabytes of internal storage, and that's for things like standard MP3 files, Spotify music, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio. It supports a lot now, and you can download more from the Connect IQ store. Okay, let's move on to the hardware, the design, and the comfort of the new Garmin Forerunner 165. As you can see here, the 165 is a fairly small watch, coming in at 43 millimeters in diameter and about 11.5 millimeters thick. This watch is also very lightweight, coming in at just 39 grams. And in terms of comfort on my wrist, I really don't mind wearing this all day. Through the night, I can sleep with it without a problem. I can run with it. And that's mainly because I'm used to larger watches like the 965 here, which is 46 millimeters in diameter. In terms of build quality on the Forerunner 165, it is very similar in construction to the older Garmin Forerunner 55, as you can see here. Both these watches are mainly made out of plastic. You can see there's really no metal bits at all throughout the entire build of the watch, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because if you scratch plastic, guess what? It's the same color all the way through, where if you do scratch a metal watch, like something like the Venu 3 here, the scratches show up a lot more on the metal. The Forerunner 165 also has the same 5-button layout that you'll find on any Forerunner watch. So you've got 3 on the left and 2 on the right, and that is a welcome addition, because if you have something like the Garmin Venu 3 here, this only has 3 buttons on the side here, so you do have to use the touchscreen to interact with it if you want to do everything. Now, on the new 165, you can interact with this watch completely by using the buttons alone. You don't even need to use the touchscreen. In fact, you can actually disable the touchscreen entirely in the settings if you only want to use the buttons, which can be pretty handy. When it comes to water resistance, the Forerunner 55 is 5 atmospheres water resistance, which is great for swimming or going in the pool or whatever, just no deep water diving or scuba diving or something like that. And if I flip this watch over, you will notice that it uses an industry standard 20 millimeter quick release band that I can pop off very easily with my fingernail and pop it back on, so I can swap out the colors and materials from all kinds of different bands you'll find on Amazon or directly from Garmin. Something else you might have noticed on the back of this watch is the optical heart rate sensor. This is a Gen 4 optical heart rate sensor from Garmin, and it's the exact same heart rate sensor that's been used on the Garmin Forerunner 265 and even the Forerunner 965 I've got here on my wrist, which is a much more expensive option. This is the Gen 4 heart rate sensor, which means it's not the Gen 5 heart rate sensor that we saw on the Garmin Venu 3 here. And the Gen 5 heart rate sensor does enable additional features features like ECG and skin temperature support. We don't have that on the 165, but that's kind of to be expected with an entry-level model. In terms of accuracy on the Gen 4 heart rate sensor, I've had pretty good luck with this heart rate sensor, and we'll talk more on accuracy later in this video. Let's move on to the elephant in the room, and probably the biggest update to the entry-level model for the Forerunner lineup is the display. This now has a 1.2-inch AMOLED touch-enabled display with 390 by 390 resolution, so it's got a very high pixel density. And I gotta say, it's a really nice display. It's very sharp, it's very vibrant, and it gets very bright. In terms of readability and using this watch day to day out in direct sunlight, I gotta say this display is quite good for a couple of reasons. It gets very bright. Like I said, I've had it on like 2/3 of the brightness in the settings, and I haven't needed to bump it up to max brightness ever, and I've gone on a few runs out in direct sunlight without an issue. And another detail that helps with readability is the fact that this actually has a flat display. And this is a welcome change for me. Now, the Garmin Forerunner 965 here and even the 265 here both have this like sort of domed curved glass display, which does look really cool, but practically it's not the best thing in the world because it is the first thing that will make contact if you fall and land on some rocks or whack your arm against a brick or the corner of a building or something. The fact that the glass on the display is raised above the bezel means there's just no protection for it. And I do find that the curvature of that glass also lends to some weird reflections. When you look at it at weird angles, it makes it a little bit hard to see. It's still a great display, but this flat display on the 165 just makes it way easier to read at just about every angle, and the fact that it's flat means that the bezel around it is actually protecting the display. I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but just in my opinion, I do prefer the flat glass compared to the curved glass, so hopefully that's a trend they keep moving forward. Now let's talk about the user interface and the smartwatch features on the new 165. So by and large, the user interface on this watch is nearly identical to every other Garmin Forerunner watch, from the 965 to the 265 to the new 165. They all look pretty much the same. These all have the same colorful user interface and the same gradients that sort of wash across the screen as I scroll through the widgets here. And it does look really nice. It makes everything easy to see. It's a pretty clean interface. In terms of smartwatch features on the 165, it's got all of the basics that you'll find on any other Garmin Forerunner. You've got phone notification support. As you can see here, I've got a YouTube comment pulled up, and that'll display any notification that comes in from Instagram, Facebook, or whatever else. On top of that, we get this excellent weather widget that looks great with this AMOLED display. And finally, we do have calendar support that'll show upcoming events on your calendar. However, one addition to the 165 that's usually missing from entry-level models is the addition of Garmin Pay. That'll let you pay for your coffee at Starbucks with your watch simply by tapping it on their credit card machine, which works great, and it's a nice feature to have as long as your bank supports it. Moving along to daily wellness tools. Again, the Forerunner 165 has all the basics that you'll find on the 265 and 965, from step counting, stairs climbed, calories burned, things like that. But on top of that, we also get the morning report breakdown, which I really appreciate, and it's a nice thing to be greeted with when you wake up. The Forerunner 165 also gets body battery and stress tracking, as you can see here, and this is the updated body battery version, which does feature the factors that play a role in your body battery. And of course, the 165 does get sleep tracking as well, and it does get the updated advanced sleep tracking that gives you a sleep score and your recovery here, and below that it has all your sleep stages and a ton of information that you can dive through as well. The 165 also gets HRV tracking with HRV status, and this will keep track of your HRV every day and let you know if you're balanced or unbalanced, which can indicate if you're overtraining, you're getting sick, or simply you drank too much wine the night before. Now that we've talked about wellness, let's talk about training tools. These are tools specifically designed to help you with your running training. So the Forerunner 165 does come with adaptive training plans with Garmin Coach, and that'll help you train for distances from 5K all the way up to half marathon. With that said, you can still train for that ultra marathon with the Forerunner 165 even when you're not using Garmin Coach, because it does have something called suggested workouts and race calendar. So if I scroll up from my watch face here, you can see two widgets for the race calendar. There's the event widget, and if I dive into that, you can see my upcoming race 6 days away. That's the Big Alta 50K out in Marin, California. Super exciting. Stay tuned for a video on that. If I click on that, it gives me details about the race. It's 51 degrees, starts at 8 a.m., the time and date. But if I scroll down, it actually gives me an estimated completion time for this event, which is way inaccurate. I'm not going to finish this in 4.5 hours, more like 8 hours probably, but I guess I could be hopeful. But more importantly, if I go to that race widget and I click this upper right button here, you can see daily suggested workouts. If I click in on that, you can see it will suggest workouts to optimize my training leading up to this race. Even though it's outside of Garmin Coach's realm, the watch can still suggest workouts. Now, of course, these are just generated workouts. They may not be super accurate, but they are a good starting point if you have no idea what you're doing. On top of adaptive training plans, when it comes to training, we do get estimated VO2 max here, as you can see. And if I scroll down, we also get a race predictor widget. If I scroll down from the VO2 max widget, we've also got the recovery advisor here. And this will try to estimate how much time you need to recover from your last activity. When it comes to training tools, that's kind of it on the Garmin Forerunner 165, which is a little bit of a bummer because on this watch, we don't get a full training load. We don't get training status, load focus, the endurance score, or the hill score that we have on the more expensive models like the 265 and 965. Now, generally, not everybody needs that stuff. The 165 has enough to get you by, and it's certainly enough to train for a full marathon or even more. I just wish they added this stuff because it's software, and we'll talk about that more at the end of this video. Let's move on to activity profiles and customization. So the 165 has about 25 activity profiles, which isn't a ton of activity profiles compared to the 965 that's got like 100. You've got all the basics from running, track running, treadmill running, weather, which is odd that it's in the activity menu. You've got biking, pool swimming, walking, cardio, strength, workouts, and if I go into this add menu, you can actually add much more from virtual run, indoor run, and now trail run is featured on the 165 as well, which is a welcome addition because it was missing on the older Forerunner 55 for some reason. The 165 also has added profiles for pickleball, tennis, strength training, high intensity interval training, cardio, yoga, and Pilates, and more. There are still a few activities missing. Most notably, there is no multi-sport or triathlon support, which again is kind of a bummer because I feel like every Forerunner should have triathlon support. And after I complete my run and sync it over to Garmin Connect to view all of my data, you'll notice there are a few additional running metrics that previously weren't there on the older Forerunner 55. The new Forerunner 165 now supports wrist-based running dynamics, so you'll get things like stride length, ground contact time, cadence, and the addition of running power on the 165 as well. And you get all of these metrics with no additional sensors just by wearing the watch on your wrist, which is super cool. On top of that, the new Garmin Forerunner 165 also supports breadcrumb navigation and mapping, which is kind of a huge deal. At $249 or $299, depending on the model, this is probably the least expensive new Garmin watch that supports navigation, and that's really good to see because that's something previously they left out, again, on the older Forerunner 55. This means you can create a course in Garmin Connect on your phone or on a computer, or you can even download a course from Strava or from a race director or something like that, upload it to your watch, and follow the course in real time. Keep in mind, this is not full-blown mapping like you'd find on the Forerunner 965, but it is very useful. On top of that, in terms of activity tracking, the Forerunner 165 does support external sensors, and that will be in the form of Bluetooth or ANT+. That could be something like a heart rate sensor like this Garmin HRM Pro Plus I have here, or even an arm heart rate sensor from COROS or Polar or something like that. When it comes to external sensors, there is one downside, and it's that the Forerunner 165 does not support cycling power sensors or power meters. Now let's talk about GPS modes and accuracy, because the previous entry-level model, the Forerunner 55, featured a single band GPS chipset, which wasn't terrible, but it also wasn't amazing. It wasn't very accurate. This time around on the 165, Garmin gave this an upgrade to include an all-systems GNSS chipset. This chipset is very similar to the one featured in the Garmin Forerunner 265 or even the more expensive Garmin Forerunner 965 I have here. Even though it gets that all-systems GNSS chipset, it's missing a couple of things. First of all, it's not a multi-band or dual-frequency chipset. You get that on the more expensive 965 or like a Phoenix or Epix model. And on top of that, the Forerunner 165 also lacks the Sat IQ auto-select function, actually toggle the GPS mode depending on your environment to maximize your battery life and your accuracy. That's not here, but that's also not a huge deal. With all that nerdy stuff said, let's talk about raw accuracy from the Garmin Forerunner 165. it's quite good. I've been on a bunch of different runs wearing the Garmin Forerunner 165 and comparing it to the Forerunner 965 and even the Polar Vantage V3, my iPhone, Suunto Race, and largely the 165 has done a great job in terms of GPS accuracy. Corners are looking sharp and out and backs are stacked right on top of each other, which is a very good sign. Not only that, at the end of most of my runs, the distance recorded from the 165 is almost exactly the same as what I recorded from the 965, so I don't really have a whole lot to say about GPS accuracy other than that it's been pretty good in my testing so far. With GPS accuracy out of the way, let's move on to battery life because they kind of go hand in hand. So this watch also gets pretty impressive battery life for a watch with an AMOLED display at this price point. You'll get about 11 days on a single charge in smartwatch use with default settings. Now keep in mind that is default settings, and if you decide to up your brightness or turn on the always on display, that'll drop down to around 4 days with maximum settings. And I would say that feels pretty accurate to what I'm seeing, but what about GPS on battery life when you're actually out on that run or ride? The Forerunner 165 can record up to 19 hours in an activity with GPS only mode. That's with the lower accuracy setting. If you do bump up the accuracy to the all systems mode, you'll get about 17 hours of use in a single activity. In terms of my real life experience with battery life in a GPS activity, I used this watch with default settings out of the box, which was brightness at 2/3, always on display was on, and all systems mode was enabled. And during that, I went on a 1 hour and 15-minute run, and I lost about 10% of battery during that activity. So if you want to maximize the battery life, make sure the always on display is turned off in activities. Next up, let's talk about heart rate accuracy from the optical heart rate sensor on the back of this watch. Again, this is the Gen 4 optical heart rate sensor, which is similar to a lot of other Garmin watches, and this does have a blood oxygen sensor in there as well. In terms of accuracy of this optical sensor, it's also pretty good. I did a bunch of testing with this as well and compared it to an ECG sensor on my chest, which is typically the most accurate and what I use as a baseline of comparison. And as you can see, looking at these graphs, the Forerunner 165 was pretty much bang on. It was pretty close to being in line with the ECG sensor on my chest, and it did look pretty similar to the Forerunner 965 as well. I will say the 165 actually did outperform the 965 in some of my testing, and I think that's because it's a lighter, smaller watch, which moves around a little bit less on my wrist, which can lead to better accuracy. And just like I said with the GPS accuracy on this watch, I'll say the same with the heart rate accuracy here. There's not a whole lot to say other than it looks pretty good so far. Okay, we've hit a point in the video where we're gonna get pretty dense here. I'm gonna pull up a couple of charts that are gonna compare the Forerunner 165 against some other models and just sort of talk through it very quickly, as efficiently as possible. So the chart you're looking at right now is a comparison between the Garmin Forerunner 165, the 265, the 965, the Venu 3, and the Vivoactive 5. There's a lot of information here, so pause the video if you want to take it all in and read through everything. I tried to include as much detail on a single page as possible because all these models are so similar, but they're so different at the same time, and I thought this might be visually helpful for people out there to try to understand the differences. Moral of the story is that the Vivoactive 5 and the Forerunner 165 are almost the exact same watch. They've got the same price point, except that the Vivoactive doesn't have the 5-button layout and relies mainly on the touchscreen. It's got a different user interface, slightly nicer build with a little bit of metal on the bezel there. It adds the sleep coach functionality along with more activity profiles, which is kind of odd because it's not a Forerunner and it has more activities. However, in every other regard other than those, the Forerunner 165, in my opinion, is superior. Having an altimeter on board, it's got navigation features, it's got more training tools, it's got wrist-based running dynamics. Now let's take a look at another chart I made because I thought this one would make sense. A comparison between the Garmin Forerunner 165 and the COROS Pace 3, which I've previously always considered one of the best value running watches on the market for under $250. Okay, so the main difference between these two is that the 165 has that super bright AMOLED display, while the COROS Pace 3 has a rather dull MIP display. But that does give the COROS the edge with battery life, blowing the 165 out of the water with nearly 40 hours in a GPS activity. Both of these have a decent selection of training and wellness tools. I think the Garmin offers more in the way of wellness with its body body battery functionality, while the COROS features more when it comes to training, like a 7-day rolling training load. You've got training status and the COROS training hub. The COROS Pace 3 also supports triathlon in multi-sport mode, while the Garmin does not, and both are made mainly out of plastic, but I do think the Garmin might have a ever so slight edge when it comes to build quality compared to the COROS. The COROS does come in $30 cheaper though than the non-music version of the 165. So as you can see from that chart, the COROS Pace 3 and the 165 are pretty evenly matched, and I do think it will boil down to whether or not you want the AMOLED display on the Garmin and the Garmin ecosystem with all of its wellness tools, or the more utility kind of aspect of the Pace 3 compared to the Garmin. Did that make sense? Oof, that was a lot of comparisons. Now let's talk about final thoughts and conclusions about the new Garmin Forerunner 165. I think this is a great entry-level watch that gains a lot of functionality over the old entry-level Forerunner 55. We've now got a fantastic AMOLED display, we've got excellent battery life, good navigation features, great GPS and heart rate accuracy, external sensor support, and a ton of wellness and training tools, all packaged in an attractive-looking, lightweight watch for under $300. Generally, I think the 165 is a win. This is a really nice watch for under $300. That being said, that $299 price point for the music version of this watch lands it squarely in a very competitive entry-level territory, with other brands like COROS or even Amazfit and Apple around that are making really solid options in that price point as well. I really wish that Garmin positioned the Forerunner 165 a bit differently and only offered a single model with music for $250. I think at that price, this would be a much easier sell, but they didn't do that. So it is what it is, and it's still a great entry-level watch at that price. It's just competing against a lot of other watches. As a side note, this is gonna be a little bit of a rant. I also continue to get more and more frustrated with Garmin holding back certain software features on certain watches. For example, the Garmin Forerunner 165 doesn't get training load, while the 265 does. The Vivoactive 5 gets Sleep Coach, while the Forerunner line didn't. The Venu 3 has a climbing and bouldering activity profile, while the 165 doesn't have that, even though it's marketed as an outdoor watch. And the 165 gains the trail running activity, but that's actually missing on the Vivoactive 5 and the Venu 3. There's so many examples of this, it's super confusing, and I just don't get why. If they simplified this and maybe offered less models and SKUs, I think they'd actually sell more watches by reducing the friction that the consumer faces when they're looking for a new watch. On the other hand, I guess that's why I have this YouTube channel, so maybe there's that. That's the end of my rant, and that's just my opinion, and I'm just some guy on YouTube, and that doesn't take away the fact that the 165 is still a great watch with all the key features at a reasonable price point. And now's the point of the video where I want to hear from you. Are you gonna buy a Garmin Forerunner 165? Are you gonna upgrade to the 265, or are you just gonna skip it and go with the Pace 3? Let me know in the comments down below what features you look for in a watch, and if this nailed it for you. I'd love to hear from you. And we did it. We made it to the end of this video, and if you're still watching, you probably liked this video, and if you did, I would really appreciate it if you went down and gave me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel down below so you don't miss more videos from me in the future. I'd really appreciate that. And while you're down there, check out the links in the description if you're planning on picking up a 165, a 265, or any other watch that I showed in this video. And while you're checking out those links, also check out the links over to my podcast channel, check out my Instagram, my Threads account, and follow me on all those other places, Strava too. That's all I have for this one. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you next time. Bye!